So I'd like to welcome everyone to this Zoom webinar. Thank you very much for logging in and joining us. And we're really delighted to have with us today Arfa Khanum Sherwani, who is in Delhi right now, and Dr. Farzana Haniffa, who is in Colombo. So we're really excited to be able to hold this event. I just want to briefly say a little bit about South Asia Solidarity Group. You know, lots of you already know us, of course, but in case you don't, we're basically an organization based in the UK. A lot of our activities are focused on amplifying the voices of people's movements for democracy, for justice, and against fascism taking place across the region of South Asia. And like everyone else, we've been trying to figure out how to continue this work, which in some ways has become more urgent than ever in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, in the context of the lockdowns, which we're all experiencing in different ways in different parts of the world. And so, well, so far, you know, we held an Instagram live concert to fundraise for the survivors of the Delhi pogrom at the end of February, which was very much a state-sponsored attack on Delhi's Muslim minority community. And we're also going to be having another fundraising event on the 25th of this month, this time focusing on the on fundraising for the migrant workers and other workers who, as people will know, have become really destitute as a result of this very unplanned and draconian lockdown, which has been imposed by the Modi government. So anyway, this is our second event, this panel on Islamophobia, fascism, and COVID-19 in India and Sri Lanka. And one of the reasons we thought it's really important to talk about this at this moment is that what we've seen is, in the context of the pandemic, an intensification of things which, of course, were already happening. And for example, in India, as you'll hear in much more detail in a moment, basically the Modi government is weaponizing the pandemic to further intensify anti-Muslim and Islamophobic violence and all kinds of attacks at a lot of different levels. And along with this, we're also seeing you know, an intensification of some of the things which were already very much hallmarks of the BJP regime since Modi came to power in the first time in 2014. So, you know, attacks on minorities, particularly Muslims and Dalits, attacks on all forms of dissent. We've seen for example, the arrests of the Dalit scholar Anand Teltumde, the human rights activist Gautam Navlakha, just in the last few days. And then this tremendous attack as well on the media, an attempt to silence any kind of criticism, which is now being done under a colonial law, actually, the Epidemic Diseases Act, which was used by the British to suppress dissent at the time of the bubonic plague. So this is sort of some of the background. Of course, as all of you will know, in India, COVID-19 came at the end of a particular period when many things had happened. If we look at the prior 7 months to the juncture that we're at now, you know, it starts in August 5th with the revoking of Article 317 Kashmir, this massive kind of step of intensifying India's occupation, and that in itself is now continuing with the internet lockdown, still not being, internet speed still not being fully restored, which means that people are more at risk with the pandemic in terms of accessing information about it, in terms of communicating at a time like this. And then, of course, you had the introduction of the Citizenship Amendment Act, along with the National Register of Citizens, and then latterly the National Population Register. And these three things together, as we know, have been a real attempt to exclude Muslims from citizenship, and a complete undermining of the basic principles of the Constitution, and led to this tremendously vibrant and powerful, peaceful movement against it, at the core of which we had the Shaheen Bagh protests in Delhi, led by Muslim women. And in a way, with the pandemic, you can see very much that it has become a pretext for more repression and for trying to almost obliterate that movement. And so, this is something which I think we'll also be hearing more about. And then meanwhile, in the context of Sri Lanka, which we're also going to be hearing about, you have some very similar things and comparable things going on, with a very highly repressive and authoritarian president, and this response to the pandemic taking place in the context of upcoming general elections. And again, this real attempt to weaponize the virus, and particularly to target Sri Lanka's Muslim minority, who are extremely vulnerable in the context of the kind of rising wave of majoritarianism which we've seen in recent months. So we're going to be, hearing about those, making some connections between the two, looking at the region. And I'm going to be taking questions after the two speakers have both talked to us. So you should be able to see a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So after both the speakers have talked, we'd like you to write your questions there, and the speakers will be able to see them, and I'll also do my best to sort of read out the questions and make sure that they're getting them. So yeah, I'd like to now introduce our first speaker, who we're really thrilled to have with us. Arfa Khanum Sherwani is a leading Indian journalist. Many of you have probably read her work. She's currently senior editor at The Wire, which is perhaps the foremost platform from which many of us are getting news and analysis of the current situation in India. She's received a Red Ink Award, the Sahitya Samman Award from the Hindi Academy, and the Chameli Devi Jain Award for Outstanding Women Mediapersons. So Arfa, I'd like to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kalpana, and I'm very, very happy and privileged to be here before your audience. I can see already more than 50 people joining us. And I think as journalists and as social activists, we are also learning new ways. As we are going with our jobs, we are also learning new ways how to survive this whole post-COVID world. Interesting that you mentioned Shaheen Bagh and NTCA and RC protest. Only about 10 minutes ago, I was writing on the subject that how the gains that we had made as a society during this 2-3 month long protest movement, resistance, I would say resistance movement, where we were trying to reimagine India, which was based on more rights and fairness and equality, how this whole COVID, this coronavirus politics, and you use the word weaponizing the virus, is trying to undo all those gains that we had made and trying to subjugate rights and trying to submit the Indian citizenry and Indian citizen into subjects, trying to control their social behaviors. And I would say this Islamophobic politics is also a part of the same project, where you curtail people's rights, you shamelessly use this health emergency, use the pretext of it to arrest people, to undermine constitution, to undermine press freedom. All of this we can see happening. And frankly, Kalpana, I was thinking that after 5-6 years of covering this very vicious, poisonous communal politics, I thought maybe this virus may have brought us together, and we should behave like one people as a united country, because this does not really discriminate on the basis of religion, gender, caste, anything, the already existing divisions in Indian society. But sadly, I had no idea that this would actually be used far more to polarize Indian society and to work on those divisions which have existed for several years. So while the world is fighting the virus, it seems, unfortunately, sadly, that India is fighting its Muslims. At least the dominant narrative that you see these days, if you open 24 hours news channels, you see Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, everywhere there is prevalent and anti-Muslim hate in your face. You cannot, even if you want to switch off from everything else, it will come to your WhatsApp then. Even if you want to disappear from all of these social media platforms, you switch off your TV, you do not even read your newspaper, then it will eventually come to your Gmail, to your WhatsApp. And this WhatsApp, particularly this messaging service, is very popular amongst the less educated Indians. So can you imagine the level of hate that in a very refined, in a very organized way is reaching to our smaller cities, to villages, to the lesser educated people who are already very terrified of this whole virus. And India is a religiously dominant country where more than 80% people, I would say, are very, very deeply religious. So that way, this already existing Islamophobia, existing hatred is being weaponized in the cover of fighting coronavirus. And sadly, I would say I was really hoping the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, when he addressed the nation on 14th of April, I thought he would be addressing this. He would try and heal the community. He would try and bridge the divisions between communities that we can see emerging. But there was not a single word from him, because we can see at the moment now there are vegetable sellers, fruit sellers being beaten up. There are people who are committing suicide. There was a man in Himachal Pradesh who was a milk seller. He attended Tablighi Jamaat event in Delhi. He went back. He was sent to quarantine for 2 weeks. When he came back, the man was taunted, bullied in a way that he ended his life. So these kind of real life consequences, real life results that we can see in India at the moment. And I'm sure most of your audience at the moment would know what happened, but I just want to quickly take them to how the origin of this whole Islamophobic campaign in the cover of fighting coronavirus, that about 3 weeks ago, I think it was the last day of March, that this news broke that Tablighi Jamaat, which is the Islamic missionary organization, and it has its roots all over, I would say more than 100 countries in the world. There is one even in the UK, and there is one even in Sri Lanka. So there are hardly any country left. I would say more than 100 countries they have their organs at. So then the news broke that there were some Jamaatis, which means the members of Tablighi Jamaat, the Islamic missionary organization, which were found to be corona positive. And as soon as the news broke, the whole narrative changed from fighting corona to now labeling one community, blaming an entire pandemic on one community. And this just happened, I would say, within the course of 3 days. That this whole thing, so now the government of India does not have to answer difficult questions on inefficient handling of this whole crisis, on autocratically announcing lockdown without even speaking to the stakeholders like state governments, without even asking people who are supposed to be implementing those lockdowns without taking anybody into account. There were millions and millions of these daily wages, the migrant laborers who were on the streets. And we filed several such reports in video and text form on the wire also, where there were small girls, small children and elderly people who walked from 100 kilometers to 700 and 800 kilometers. They walked. In 2020 world, people are walking 700, 800 kilometers, and there were about 36 people who died as a direct or indirect result of this unplanned lockdown. But you don't have to answer any of it because you have blamed an entire pandemic on one community. So everything is taken care of. And this whole Islamophobic agenda is cemented. It's more strong than what it was. So I am saying we are really staring, and it gives me goosebumps when I'm saying this, we are staring at nothing short of a pandemic apartheid. Because this is the kind of campaign that are running, and at least even if not nationwide, in some pockets we are still already witnessing it. That these poorest of the poor people, there are no people who are more marginalized than these vegetable sellers who had nothing. I mean, they cannot even hope for a meal tomorrow if they have eaten today. So these are the people who are now at the center of this whole Islamophobic campaign. I'm really hoping, still hoping the government would take a note of it. They would try to work on it. I would like to acknowledge something here which is very important, which I would say I'm sure must have happened with the instructions of the government. That at least in the state of Uttar Pradesh, we saw police handles on Twitter calling out journalists who were spreading fake news. There were news organizations, news agencies spreading fake news. So that we saw at least happening for the last, I would say, roughly seven to 10 days. So this is some good news I can give you, some kind of a healer, that at least maybe the government sense that this can create some kind of a terrible social unrest. So maybe for their sake, but I would say this is a good step, and we should acknowledge this, and this is a good thing. And I would hope that this is not just limited to Uttar Pradesh, but this will be nationwide. So this is the cause.
I wanted to say that, did you want to add anything about the what has been happening in the last few days? Because I think there's been a lot of arrests and a lot of repression, which obviously is taking place more easily because of the kind of suspension of civil liberties, essentially, in the context of the virus.
I mean, of course, it is very, very shocking what we can see now, from Jamia's PhD students to AMU medical students to the attack on the Wire, that there was an FIR registered against the editor, and for the Wire, there were 2 FIR registered against us. So, you know, while the journalists are supposed to be informing people, this whole pretext is being used against people who are supposed to be reporting on the issue. And also, this is some kind of a, I would say, vindictive act, that people who participated in NTCA and RC protest, and some of them were leading it, some of the young students were leading it. Now they are at the receiving end of the government's, this whole thing, that why they are arresting them now. So I would say that initially I talked about how the rights are being subjugated, and this whole thing is being used because, you know, the courts are not functioning properly. Police is also busy in containing and keeping people indoors. But at the same time, the priorities of the government, it's shocking that they are still managing resources and manpower to arrest people, to put them in jail when the world is already freeing their prisoners, even when they are dead. You know, they're freeing the prisoners, letting them go out of the jails because there is a real danger of them, prisoners, getting infected of the virus. But the priorities of our government are entirely different.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Arfa, and we'll definitely, you know, have more of a discussion. So I'm sure lots of people have questions, but I'm going to first move on to introduce Dr. Farzana Haniffa. As I said, she's joining us from Colombo. She's a faculty member at the Department of Sociology in the University of Colombo. And she has written extensively on the minority Muslim community in Sri Lanka, about the history of displacement during the 30-year-long war, and also about the new thrust of state-sponsored Sinhala Buddhist nationalist violence against the Muslim community, which is taking place in post-war Sri Lanka. So I'd like to hand over to you, Farzana.
Thank you, Fatma. Okay, so it was really interesting listening to Arfa. So clearly the context in which, COVID, the response to the COVID virus is happening is really important to understand sort of the politics of what is going on. Now, we are currently in a really strange political moment, in addition to, of course, the stress of the virus. Now, strange in the sense of, we had a presidential election in 2019, November, huge change after that. And now we are anticipating, as you said, a general election. So, and in the context of that anticipation, we also must understand that our opposition has completely fallen apart. So in anticipation of a result for the election, it's not really a competition. I mean, the sense is that it's not a competition between the two parties as much as, what is the margin by which the people are slotted to win are going to be, right? And it seems really important for the regime to win with a two-thirds majority for the kinds of political steps that they want to take. So that's the context within which what is happening. Now, as you said, the sort of the anti-Muslim sort of permutations of the COVID response are also becoming clearer as the days pass, right? But before that, I think maybe history of the anti-Muslim movement in Sri Lanka. So while we've always had, kind of level of discomfort among communities, it was always generally manageable among Muslims and Sinhalese. And also, of course, the 30 years of conflict kind of, distracted from other kinds of in society. So, but after the end of the war in 2009, the anti-Muslim sentiment in the country was actually cultivated by a very organized and seemingly well-funded movement that sort of had a kind of a coordinated social media presence, but also called huge meetings. Monks in the yellow robes got on podia and sort of like spread this particular language of anti-Muslim hate. So that was going on for a long time after the end of the war in 2009. So much so that the anti-Muslim sentiment is quite sedimented now, and it's available organization not just by a particular regime but across the regimes. Now, it is also important to note that sort of what enables this sort of anti-Muslim sentiment and the agitations and the violence that it leads to is supported by a kind of infrastructure which was very anti-minority that grew as a consequence of the conflict, right? So, during 30 years of war, you have sort of a police force, for instance, which is mostly constituted of the majority community with very little minority representation. And you have, a very particular kind of narrative of Sinhala majoritarianism, and then at the end of the war of Sinhala supremacy, that sort of is cultivated, and it has a really strong base from which the anti-Muslim sort of sentiment and actions are also fed. And I think it's really important that we take this into consideration, because there is a tendency to look at the sort of the anti-Muslim sentiment and the mobilization towards anti-Muslim violence as something particularly Muslim, right? That it has to do with the Muslims only. And it really is not. It is like sort of the structural preconditions that like predate the war, right? Okay, so so in 2014 we had violence, and when the regime changed in 2015, and we had new regime in play, there was a sense that maybe that phase, maybe that particular mobilization was done. But in 2018, there was violence again, and the state was completely managing or stopping it, or actually of like sort of like mobilizing to stop the rhetoric. So it was clear that, you know, there was a real sort of support for this kind of language, for this kind of sentiment, and it could be mobilized at a moment, well, not a moment's notice, but it could easily be mobilized to perpetrate violence against Muslims. And this could be for a variety of reasons. I mean, this happened in the aftermath of an election. Usually in the sort of lead up to elections, you have this sort of like amping up of anti-Muslim sentiment in the past, you know, after the war. And so the violence happened in the immediate aftermath of the election, right? So you know, in many ways, it is sort of setting the groundwork for this sort of anti-Muslim mobilization. Okay, but it's also interesting, you know, the sort of the factors that impact on the circumstances right now are also interesting, because in 2019, as you know, April 2019, there was this attack on Easter Sunday on 3 churches and 3 hotels by Muslim suicide bombers, right? Supposedly inspired by ISIS, but local Muslim suicide bombers detonated themselves. Now, that, I mean, it absolutely fed the already existing anti-Muslim sentiment, and the way in which the country as a whole understood one as in relation to the April bombings was from that perspective, from the rhetoric of the anti-Muslim movement. You know, there were also all of these conversations at the moment of the bombings, right, about the failure of the state to respond adequately, the failure of the security establishment to take cognizance of the intelligence that they had of the possibility of the bombings happening. So all of this ultimately was really, didn't become part of the larger narrative of what happened to Sri Lanka. It became something that the Muslims did, right? So there is this understanding that, or not the understanding, but this attribution of blame for the entire episode to the entire Muslim community of Sri Lanka. Okay, so now that kind of framing is also the background within which the sort of the anti-Muslim kind of rhetoric at the time of the coronavirus is also happening, right? Now, the most troubling way in which the anti-Muslim sentiment is impacting is with regards to the issue of burials. Now, on the 27th of March, there was this document that was formulated by the Ministry of Health Provisional Clinical Practice Guidelines on COVID-19. It's about how suspected and confirmed patients are to be, the deaths of suspected and confirmed patients are to be dealt is one section of that document, right? So on the 27th, the document read as permitting burials. But when when a Muslim person died on the 30th, when someone died on the 30th, that person was refused burial, right? Now and then the day after that, the health ministry guidelines were changed to reflect cremation only. Now, at that point, there was a lot of mobilization to appeal to the Ministry of Health to consider the needs of the Muslims who wanted to have burial and not cremation. But there was really a very sort of like firm line that was taken by the Ministry of Health, by the doctors, by the judicial medical officers on the refusal burials. Now, the way in which it was talked about was that cremation was obviously the best way to do it. Why are the Muslims being so selfish about this? I mean, it is not about sort of individual requirements. It is about the good of the country. And why are Muslims, again, thinking only about themselves? And why is this even a question? I mean, the rational thing to do was to do the cremations and not the burials, right? So now, I mean, we pushed for, just a minute, please. Okay, sorry. We pushed for a recognition of the WHO guidelines that allow for cremations and burials, but we were told that they were only guidelines, right? So the various kinds of scientific positions were put forward, like the water table was high in Sri Lanka, that we didn't have the technology through which to ensure that the body bags that were used would be sealed properly, that the caskets would be sealed properly. So all of these, endless number of sort of justifications for why not to do burials. I mean, there was never one instance in the state's response where there was an attempt to see whether burials could be done, right? So us working on this issue, it was really very clear the extent to which the anti-Muslim sentiment had sedimented, that, the scientific community themselves were completely, to a very large extent, completely committed to this position of not allowing burials. Okay, so now a couple of days later, I mean, the rhetoric sort of shifted slightly, and it became clearer and clearer that there were no real problems with regards to the burial, and that the cremation was not the way in which we were going to sort of come out of this crisis, right? I mean, there were other things that needed to be done. For instance, like testing. We are still very low in terms of like the kinds of testing that we're doing. But that was not emphasized, and it became clearer and clearer that this really had nothing to do actually with the science, but that it was a very political decision, right? So now on the on the 7th or 8th of April, the Prime Minister addressed the nation, right? And okay, so just before that, now there was one death which was refused burial. Then there were two more, and each was a community sort of like comes together to try to somehow work out a process by which burial can be approved, right? But on the 8th, there was a statement by the Prime Minister which very clearly stated that this is not the time to ask for burials and for ask for sort of special treatment. I mean, these are the kinds of ways in which he put forward his position, and this was a time to come together as a country to fight this huge battle that we are facing, right? So at that point, it became increasingly clear. I mean, if it wasn't clear earlier, that this really was about the elections, and it really was not at all about the science or about COVID or any of that, right? And just before the deaths occurred, also when the sort of the anti-Muslim element of this whole thing started becoming very clear. For instance, suddenly, Muslims were the most number of COVID suspect cases. That day, Muslims were the ones who were staying on Friday and therefore, circumventing the rules. Muslims were not telling their travel history. Muslims were, not informing the doctor of their symptoms, and therefore having the entire sort of clinic that they visited go into lockdown. So I mean, any other way of sort of presenting that fact, like, low-income neighborhoods where Muslims were not Muslims, just anybody could not self-isolate, all of those kinds of things. One is very familiar with this kind of trope of fault, right? So right now, where we are at is that, there seems to be very little likelihood. We are hoping that this is not the case, but there seems very little likelihood of burials for Muslims being permitted. The government has made clear through lots of regulations and lots of circulars that going to be a firm position. They even gave sort of new regulations under the we have a Quarantine Act, which again dates from colonial times, and they even gazetted new regulations under that Quarantine Act to make sure that it was no burials and cremations only. It seemed it seems like there may really be no shift. So yeah, so that's kind of where we're at. Now, recently, just now, a few hours ago, the government announced that we are going to be coming out of lockdown. The curfew is going to be lifted soon, and we are going back into sort of like slowly starting, normality back from next week onwards, from the 20th onwards. So this is in anticipation of the election. Now, there are a lot of experts who are saying that we are not really ready for an election, but the government seems committed to the election and to taking forward their own political agenda. So, I mean, the sort of the initial response, where it seemed as if the government was really kind of taking the threat of the region and doing all of the right things, quote unquote, right, in terms of lockdown and curfew and all of those kinds of things. Well, it seems now that all of those were also, as long as it fit in with a particular political agenda, it was okay. And if it didn't, then, shifting was really not that much of a problem. So it is left to be seen as to how things will pan out. But for now, by next week, things are going to slowly return to normal in Sri Lanka, quote unquote. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Farzana, for that introduction to the whole situation, and also giving us some of the background to the kind of context in which such a kind of crisis has emerged. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the different actors who are present in this, because you were talking about obviously the state and the kind of very rigid line they've taken over the issue of burials and what that means. I mean, are there I know that you've also looked at the Sinhala Buddhist organizations and so on. So is that something, have they also been kind of part of this process in the nationalist organizations, whipping up this kind of blaming?
Okay, so I don't see them playing a huge and transformative role in this issue of the burials, okay? There is a presence, and there's always a sort of a spike in anti-Muslim sentiment at particular moments of the year. And March and April seems to be a particularly, high time for a particular spike in the anti-Muslim sentiment because of the businesses that get organized during this time for the Sinhala New Year, right? So the cultivation of anti-Muslim sentiment to ensure that the patronizing of Muslim businesses is as low as possible sometimes happens at this time. Not sometimes, it usually does, okay? Now, in relation to, the media in Sri Lanka has been quite horrendous in terms of like, no holds barred racism in Sri Lanka. Recently one channel known for its racism, they were caught out, and it's not really clear whether it was intentional or not, discussing the manner in which to ensure that the Muslims don't get their way with regards to burials. And this discussion happened during a break and among the panelists and the sort of the presenter, right? So at that point, tensions were really high and the Muslim community was really struggling to figure out what to do in relation to the burials. This comes out. And so the sort of the complicity in the media and the racism was just very clear. So I see the media playing a huge role, more so even than the sort of the confirmed sort of zealots of the anti-Muslim movement, right? It seems to me that at this point in Sri Lanka, the spread of the anti-Muslim movement is so, the anti-Muslim sentiment is so normalized, right? That it doesn't require those kinds of flag bearers to be present. I just need to say one more thing. which is that now, the presidential election was won in the aftermath of the April bombings on a platform of securitization and, a very militaristic securitization, right? So in the aftermath of that victory, when the COVID crisis happened, now, the people running the quarantine centers are the military. Now, we were told yesterday by the president, actually, a couple of days ago, that military intelligence is helping in the sort of the contact tracing, right, of the affected population. The contact tracing is being done by military intelligence. So I think you need to take cognizance of what all of this means, right, for sort of the democratic space in the country.
Okay, no, I think that's absolutely very, very, very important. And I think there are also a lot of connections and parallels with the kind of situation which Arfa was talking about in the Indian context. I'm going to move on now because I know there's a lot of, there's a number of questions which have already been put in. I think all the panelists should be able to see them. At the bottom, there's a Q&A icon, and if you click on that, you should be able to see them. But I'm just going to read them out, and then please do respond. So first of all, there's a comment from Zubair who says, "Can't we have an umbrella of lawyers and media personnel who can file cases on this gaudy media for spreading false, communal, and irrelevant news, which eventually is destroying our nation?"
Yeah, I would like to.
Yeah, sure. I'll just go through them and then please do go ahead after that. Because then we have Amrit Wilson asking, can we hear about whether the RSS is involved in policing the lockdown? Meena Dhanda is asking about that she says in the UK media regularly airing the views of scientists and medical experts which the public can compare to the politicians' pronouncements. Is there comparable attention to the experts' views like modeling and predictions in India and Sri Lanka? And then Amrit is asking specifically to Farzana, we've heard that there were a huge number of arrests after the Easter bombings. What has happened to those people? Are they still in prison? And also, have Muslims been arrested after the lockdown? And then there is a comment from a question from Sanjeeva Lokuge, which I think is more of a comment. It's about the debate on cremation versus burial. So I'm not going to read it out in full, but do respond if you'd like to. And also, in the comments, we have a question from Anandi Ramamurthy about is there any resistance to the oppression faced by migrant workers and Muslims? And are there any expressions of solidarity? And Nirmala Rajasingam has asked about the role of the media, which I think Farzana already responded to. So yeah, that's what we have so far. So Arfa, did you want to respond to some of those questions first?
It was an interesting question that can we take the pliant, obedient media to court for spreading Islamophobia? Yes, we can. Should we? We should. But at the same time, I would say I do not have my hopes high on courts these days. The courts aren't the same courts that we used to know them as. I hope the honorable courts do not, I don't have to face their wrath, but recently only, it's been now 3 days, Chameli Devi Jain, the Muslim organization, had gone to court saying the same thing, Supreme Court, that there is vicious propaganda based on lies and anti-Muslim hatred that's being spreaded in the name of fighting Corona. The court replied saying, we cannot gag the media. So the same court which says that the journalists should be going through the government and should be verifying facts from them before airing them, the same court that containing Islamophobia would be gagging the media. So I would still say, still exercise your rights, as you say, that the more you exercise your rights, the more you get them. Do not surrender them yet. go to a different court. If you don't get justice, go to another court. Justice system in India is still alive. We've met a lot of disappointments recently, but at the same time, I would say one should do that. Another very important thing one should do is to make this full pliable, blind media irrelevant by not watching them. I still wonder why millions and millions of people still watch them. You know, they are irrelevant the moment you stop watching them. I do not think that they represent even 20% of India anymore. They just represent a very dominant socio-political group and the government agenda. That's all their relevance is for. So I really wonder, and I would request everybody to just stop watching all these channels that you call Godi media or client media.
Okay, so there's a question about arrests after the Easter bombings and Muslims being arrested after the lockdown. Now, the arrests after the Easter bombings, there are some people who are still inside. What I've heard is that, you know, the government is anticipating doing various kinds of sort of rehabilitation activities before they're released. But the sense is that they should be released fairly soon, was what I heard, prior to the COVID crisis. Now, in the aftermath of the COVID crisis, there seems to be a sort of a new investigation, a new process that the government is engaged in to address the issue of investigating into the Easter bombings. So under that process, I don't know if there's anything that's going to change. Now, in relation to arrests, there were two particularly troubling arrests. One was this journalist who wrote in Sinhala in the middle of the crisis regarding burials that Muslims need to get organized for an ideological jihad. And he was arrested under the ICCPR Act and remanded. So under the ICCPR Act, he cannot be bailed unless he goes to the High Court. So I'm not sure exactly what is happening now because courts are not functioning properly because of the lockdown. Now, then there was a second arrest made recently of a very well-known lawyer, and this arrest is particularly cause for particular concern because people entered his house as representatives of the public health infrastructure, right? Public health inspectors. They came as public health inspectors, and then the lawyer was arrested. And we still don't know on what basis he was arrested and for why, and what the reason is, right? So, but these are still, I mean, I can't really say too much about them because they just happened like the arrest was like a couple of days ago. But in this current context, right, where our courts are not properly functioning, parliament has been dissolved, you know, it's really frightening to think about the consequences for our systems. Now, in relation to, there was a question about, the question about a recent latest display of anti-Muslim sentiment of the GMO, that is the Government Medical Officers Association, which is a union of doctors, considering the Muslim population as an important factor in their strategy, in their exit strategy, right? So this was a very, again, a very telling indication of the normalization of the racism in Sri Lanka, because, you know, of several criteria. One was population density, and the other one was the number of Muslims, right? That would speak to the you know, factors affecting control of the disease in that area. So, you know, this was called out by a couple of people, and the GMO was quick to withdraw that, and they deleted that from their document. And so we appreciate that, for instance, that they did that. But I mean, the sort of the normalization of this kind of thinking without any resistance, you know, at that level of society, you know, this is a professional body that is doing it, right? Is is really cause for concern, and it really would be, the government really needs to intervene to stop some of this, right? And great if they do, but right now there aren't any signs that they will. Last question, sorry, should I stop and maybe you take a few more questions? Sorry.
Yeah, I think I'll just direct some of the questions which have come up for Arfa, and then I will again come back to you, because I know there are a number of other questions which people want to ask you. I think, Arfa, I just wondered if you could comment on the earlier question about the policing role, which we've heard has been taken on in various places by the RSS in the context of the lockdown. And there's also a couple of other questions I wanted to highlight. One is, can you say anything about how the lockdown is being experienced differently in, excuse me, in Kashmir compared to India? And then there was also a question how the mainstream media house is responding to the FIR filed against the editor of The Wire. So,
yeah. I think I'll begin with the RSS bit. There was a news item that I got to see, and there was this, that some of the RSS people, they were manning the streets, asking people to show their iCards, and that happened in the state of Telangana. There was a lot of hue and cry on social media, and after that, I heard the government of Telangana, they issued a clarification saying they do not have any passes or license to break the lockdown or inspect people, or they do not have any powers to do so. So I would still say there is so much that is lost in India, but still, continue to make noise about it. The recent example of the FIR on The Wire, where the editor was asked to physically be present in Ayodhya, when there was a lot of outcry on social media. The police, Uttar Pradesh police called up our editor and said that no need to be physically present breaking the lockdown. You can just file your reply on the email. So what I'm trying to say here is that it really works. So I'm sure if the whole RSS business, this whole incident would have gone unnoticed, maybe they would have continued to do it, not just in Telangana, maybe other parts of Andhra Pradesh and other maybe adjoining states, you never know. Because if all of this gets unchecked and the vigilant citizens do not really pay attention to who should be policing us, whether we should be policed at all, I think, so this was, I think, taken care of. What was the other question that the liberals on Kashmir?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I actually can't read too much about what's happening in Kashmir at the moment, but I'm sure it's entirely different from rest of India, because first of all, our civil rights are not surrendered the way they are taken back from Kashmiri citizens in Kashmir. Internet services are working well here. I am using 4G. Kashmiris, they can't even properly use 2G. The government of India's direction, the education department says that all schools should be giving now online classes. Only yesterday, I got to see some Kashmiris telling Twitter that they can't really connect in 2G. It takes you forever to connect, on Zoom or use applications like Zoom or Skype or anything. And Indians are not living under the shadow of guns. Rest of the India, as Kashmiris are forced to. Even press freedom, for that matter, is much more curtailed, even by the standards of now how we are. Indian presses at the moment is much worse in Kashmir. So I would say there is absolutely no comparison between what life is like in Kashmir and what life is like in rest of India.
Okay, thank you for that. And just to say that, we do hope to have a session specifically focusing on the situation in Kashmir in the near future. So do look out for that. I wanted to also just ask both of you, there's a question which has come up, which is kind of about kind of regional alliances. So Nirmala Rajasingham says that she's read a news report in one of the mainstream media outlets that the RSS, the Bodubala Sena in Sri Lanka, and the Burmese Buddhist nationalists had met in Mumbai to declare a Indian Ocean Hindu-Buddhist peace zone, as they called it, for both. So she's asking both of you whether you see such regional cooperation emerging amongst these fascists. And I thought maybe after that you might want to talk a little bit about, there's a couple of people really asking about resistance, alliances, and this kind of thing. So how is the Muslim community in Sri Lanka organizing to face the challenges of Sinhala Buddhist majoritarianism? What alliances are being made at the level of parties, at the level of grassroots community organizations? And then there was a question earlier from Anandi Ramamurthy where she says, is there any resistance to the oppression faced by migrant workers and Muslims in the Indian context? And are there any expressions of solidarity? So I think those questions both about kind of alliances and linkages between fascists and far-right groups, and also about alliances of resistance is really an important one. So for both. Yeah, do you want to take that? And then I'll also ask Farzana.
Well, not that something that we really know of, that there was any resistance, I would say, or any kind of a solidarity. Not really, unfortunately not that we know about. I mean, of course, there are several non-governmental organizations providing food to people. There are more non-governmental organizations providing food than the governmental organization providing food. So that's a moment, I would say, a solidarity moment, irrespective of religion. And it's also the food and other things are also being distributed irrespective of religion. So there's not been much, I would say, thankfully, not much that I could hear that people were discriminating based on religion or caste. There were a few instances where some people, they denied food to Dalit community, people from the community, or some people from upper caste community, they refused to take food from people from the Dalit community. That we could hear. But besides that, I think poverty and discrimination, it's a great leveler. When you are a migrant worker, you will be forced to live the same life. That's what I think we should understand at the end of the day, that despite being victims and even sometimes perpetrators of the same ideology, same divisive communal ideology, one should understand the poverty, I think, is the biggest religion. When you are poor, nobody cares. I mean, you are actually doomed to live the same life, whether you are a Hindu, Muslim, or Sikh, Isai, you are an upper caste. I mean, of course, the life would be far more worse if you belong to minority community, if you belong to a lower caste group. But what I'm here trying to say is that at the end of the day, nobody really asked when millions of those migrant workers, when they had to walk on their feet, whether which religion they really came from, or which religious tradition or caste group they came from. So not that I heard much about any solidarity. Rather, I would say we can hear already people subjugating to this dominant narrative of Muslims being accused of spreading coronavirus. Can you imagine something? Can there be anything more absurd than this? That Muslim community, 200 million people conspiring against 1.3 billion people, or maybe 1.1 billion people, rest of the 1.1 billion people, that there is some kind of an act of vindication that they would spread the virus. And this very interesting thing is that for you to spread the virus, first of all, you have to be infected with the virus. So even for these Jamaatis, I would say, most of them, since of course all of them are Muslims, so when they went back to the communities, to residential areas, they mostly went to the Muslim residential areas. So the number of people they infected, most of them, I would say, majority of them were Muslims. So I don't know. I mean, whether this conspiracy theory, even if you apply even minimum basic common sense, you cannot really hold this.
Yeah, I mean, just to come in on that very briefly before I hand over to Farzana. we're also, I mean, you mentioned about all the groups that are organizing to try and provide relief to the people who've been made destitute, basically, particularly migrant workers. And as I mentioned, we are going to be having a fundraising concert. We're working on that with the AICCTU, which is a trade union which is very much engaged with the relief efforts, and also with trying to counter the these Islamophobic lies and fake news and so on. And I saw a very interesting a tweet where they actually, people who are involved in relief efforts mentioned that some of the survivors of the Delhi pogroms were actually donating to those fundraising drives. So that solidarity, as you said, it kind of exists on that level of really people who have almost nothing and who are then sharing what little they have. So yeah, please, those of you who are watching, do look out for our event, which will be on the 25th of March on Instagram. So yeah, I want to hand over to Farzana now to answer some of the questions which have come up, particularly about these alliances between different fascist groups, and also any forms of how the Muslim community is responding or trying to counter.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to comment on something that Arfa said also just very quickly. It's just astounding, called upon to defend or justify or explain away, no? I mean, the whole conspiracy theory that we really have to say that, this doesn't make sense. I think it's just like atrocious, right? I mean, in terms of what we are called upon to do. Just a comment. So in terms of like the allegiances between, like, say, the RSS and organizations in Myanmar, now the Bodubala Sena had very clear connections with Ashin Viratu of Myanmar, and so that was clear in 2014-15 in Sri Lanka. So that link is sort of fairly well established now, and we also know that in the north of Sri Lanka, in the Tamil-speaking areas, there is a strong presence of the RSS, and the anti-Muslim, the intensification of anti-Muslim sentiment in those areas can really be attributed to that. So that is not at all surprising, and I'm sure that they're getting on really well, and the organizing is going on, right? Because the results are clear to us in Sri Lanka. So I mean, I didn't know about this particular meeting, but that's quite a well-established sort of like network that we are quite aware of. Okay. Now, in terms of Muslims and responses, so since the emergence of the Bodubala Sena in around 2012, 2013, one of the most powerful organizations that worked to sediment, and they did an amazing job. And I mean, several years later, now this is like, a regular sort of conversational topic in Sri Lanka. Everyone is sort of on board with this sort of anti-Muslim sentiment, right? So ever since they emerged, there's been sort of like, small attempts by different Muslim communities who were caught completely off guard, right? Caught completely off guard, did not anticipate. And so, and I think the Muslim communities that are affected are different, and they have sort of are struggling to figure out how to respond. And so this is, most civil society organizations that are trying to do this are all sort of volunteer driven, and not funded like the kind of the other huge human rights organization network in Sri Lanka. That is not the sort of the primary area from which the sort of the resistance to this anti-Muslim movement is emerging. So I mean, there's some of that, but not fully. So the organizing is still kind of fairly ad hoc, and it's sort of a response to issues that emerge, right? So again, we were caught really by surprise when this whole sort of like the burial issue emerged, for instance, and so we organize around that. Right? And then there's another issue, and then we organize around that. And then there's the violent event that happens, then we organize around that. So there are a few attempts to be a bit more sustained in the response, and a bit more organized in terms of how we think about what we want at the end of this, right? But all of that is still fairly new. And and the linkages across different kinds of activists is still quite tenuous, I would say. I just want to respond to one question that came up, which I think it might be important for my Sri Lankan audience. And that question was about, what kind of expertise should we take on as the expertise on which to base these kinds of questions regarding burial versus cremation. And there was a criticism of, there was a pointing to the criticism that the WHO had also gotten. So I would just like to say that the position that, many of the Muslim groups that I've worked with is not necessarily that the option of burial is off the, the option of cremation is off the table. It is just that the government takes into consideration the possibility of burial, at least in certain instances, right? When all of the conditions are met, like for instance, the water table and the depth of the grave and all of those kinds of things. And the problematic issue was that there was never any attempt made to take any steps in the direction of accommodating the possibility even, right? So the fact that, at the get of the blanket no is what is the issue, is the issue. And so that is what sort of like gives us the sentiment that for the accommodation of a Muslim issue was too much of a stretch, right? Even listening to a request from the community was not something that could be accommodated. So that is the way in which I would respond to that. So I think I'll stop.
There's also a question about the response of the academic community in Sri Lanka to the spike in anti-Muslim sentiment. This is basically particularly from the majority community. Shamila Yusuf Ali is asking about the response of the academic community.
Let me just, I'm not sure that you can conceptualize Sri Lanka's academic community as one, right? And I don't think that there is a Sinhala academic community versus like a Muslim academic community. I mean, I think there are particular academics who have a particular kind of progressive politics, and they have always been on board with a critique of the anti-Muslim movements, have supported like petition writing, have supported sort of like documentation efforts. Now, I've been documenting this work since the Alutgama violence of 2014. And prior to that, we did the documentation of anti-Muslim events or occurrences. And for all of those, I've had support from my colleagues who had a particular politics about those kinds of issues, a particular commitment to a particular kind of democracy for Sri Lanka. So from that, I mean, that sort of like critical mass of support has not lessened. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay. I think I'm going to ask you both to kind of make some concluding comments or just reflect on anything you feel you haven't had a chance to talk about. And I just had a question really for both of you, which was about the role of the diaspora or diasporas in this context, because I think one of the things which we are very committed to in South Asia Solidarity Group is to, particularly in the case of Modi, he very much projects this idea that, the diaspora is with him, the diaspora is behind him in this fascistic project. And, one of our goals is very much to counter that. And in some ways we've been doing that all through. And to kind of raise the kind of voices of dissent and opposition in the diaspora. So in this particular juncture, this particular moment, what do you feel that is something you'd like to say in that context? I just want to ask you about that. And then please do just, say anything which you haven't had a chance to say so far, basically. Yeah, so I'll ask Arfa first. Yeah.
So I think diaspora can and has played a huge role because I know they have stakes in India's future. They have roots here. They have only been physically been away from India, but not mentally and not emotionally, I would say. I think the first thing what one can do in terms of supporting and pitching in for press freedom and suppression of press is that you can all write to the ambassadors, the high commissioners in your country, Indian high commissioners and Indian ambassadors, and register your displeasure, register your discontent, and say that you do not agree with this suppression of press and you do stand for press freedom in terms of the wire, I'm saying. So that one thing you can do, and maybe for all other things, you can always write to Indian government, you can write to the Prime Minister, you can write to the President, you can write to respective member of parliaments, whoever you think. I mean, internet is a very empowering thing. You do not really physically have to do it. There are all internet, all email addresses available on all these sites. So you can very well do that. You can even physically post letters, write letter to the President, Prime Minister, Chief Justice of India, to the ambassadors and high commissioners in your own countries. I think that's what you can do. Even within those circles, diaspora circles, you can do that. So that's one thing that I can think of offhand. Maybe there's much more that you can. Maybe publish, like somebody just asked a question saying that this whole Muslim blaming thing has distracted people. Of course it has. And this was meant to distract. Otherwise, maybe if the media wanted to even run this agenda, the government of India should have come with a statement and said that this will not be accepted, like all other governments did, like Kerala government did. And very surprisingly, I'm very pleasantly surprised, even the government of Karnataka is ruled by the BJP. The chief minister said that this is unacceptable, this whole anti-Muslim will not be tolerated. So if Kerala can, if Karnataka can, if Maharashtra can, why can't the government of India, the Prime Minister? So I think we need to build more pressure on the government to say that there are more stakeholders, there are more people who are for peace, who are for unity, who want to fight this whole thing as united instead of as divided people. So I think public pressure really, really works in a democracy. No other way to do it. There was an interesting question on whether we've got enough support from the mainstream media when this FIR was filed against The Wire. I would say yes and no. First of all, we'll have to define what mainstream media is. But I would say most of the newspapers published this report. There were websites on which editorials were written. There were op-eds written, not just in national press, but international press. But if by mainstream media you mean TV channels, I would say almost zero. Not that I noticed. I did not see any news clip, even broadcasting that something like that happened, leave aside solidarity. But from the print side, from digital media, from international media, from civil society groups, there are close to 4,000 people who signed the petition, showing solidarity with The Wire. And there was not just social activists, but there were academics and there were film actors, there were producers, there were a lot of journalists, bureaucrats, judges. All of these people signed. 4,000 people did that, and I'm sure there are many more who are wanting to stand behind us, and they have our backs. But I would say TV was mostly silent, but there've been enough support, and we are happy about it.
Okay. I just wanted to also ask you one of the other questions which you might have missed, which I think is an interesting one, which is a question from Yatu, where he's asking, what is your sense of, how pervasive this idea that Muslims are somehow responsible for spreading coronavirus in? How far has that penetrated to rural areas, villages, and so on? Is that, do you feel that it's it's penetrated everywhere, or is it, more something which is in urban areas? It's obviously being spread very rapidly on social media, and WhatsApp networks certainly reach rural areas. But do you have any sense of that? Is that something which you would find that idea everywhere, or is it more?
So right, so one of the things that that's affecting us at the moment is the press, the journalists are not working in full strength. So I would say there is only maybe 20% of the stories, 30% maybe are being reported as we would have in the normal circumstances. But even having said that, I would say that this is mostly a very urban and a semi-urban phenomena. And I would really hope and I would really wish that it has not reached the villages, but we really need to find out. We have not really reported from villages. We've not really reported how lockdown, the impact of lockdown in rural India. So if we have not reported that, we don't really know what's happening in rural India, because there is so much happening already in urban areas, in semi-urban areas, in smaller towns. And I'm sure this has reached smaller towns as well. Villages, I'm not too sure, but big cities, towns, even smaller towns, this whole Islamophobic propaganda. And, I'm very worried about the fact that this is not going to go away with the departure of coronavirus. So we might survive coronavirus, and hopefully, inshallah, we will survive coronavirus, not just India, but as a global community. But what I am not too sure about is whether the Islamophobic, this anti-Muslim hatred is going to go away with coronavirus. This is a very deep-seated, deep-rooted thing, and this is working now on already existing prejudices and biases. So that is why it has worked more. Not that this was suddenly invented with coronavirus. This is not something that happened overnight. So I think the ripples of it, the negative effect of it, is going to be felt even much after Corona has left India and has left the world.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to ask Farzana to come in now, just for her final comments and any response to any more of the questions which you can see there. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I think there's a question from Nirmala Rajasingham. Now, she asked the question as to whether there is any discussion about an alliance between the Muslim Tamil political parties, in relation to Sri Lanka. Right now, I am not aware of any of those, any conversations of that nature. I think it is possible, and but there's also, some things that might impact on those conversations is that in the aftermath of the April bombings, the actions against Muslims in Jaffna and in Batticaloa was quite intense. And so the anti-Muslim sentiment in Tamil-speaking areas of the country is also quite intense. So I'm not sure how that's going to impact any possibility of an alliance. An alliance has always been really difficult because of nationalism and its take on Muslims, and some things that happened during the war. But I mean, it seems necessary at this particular juncture. So I'm not quite sure how that is going to pan out, but no real evidence of that at this point. In terms of concluding, well, I mean, it's a really difficult, decisive time for Sri Lanka right now. And I mean, in terms of being the diaspora community, I guess I would echo what Arfa also said in terms of making, if you have an alternative perspective to what is going on right now in Sri Lanka, then please make your voice heard in whichever way possible, because I think those voices, there is a sort of like a ripple effect of all those voices, and that is really needed. So yeah, I think I could just stop there actually.
I think you've really both covered a tremendous amount of ground and given us a really, really important overview of this really very, very frightening and disturbing situation, and also given us a sense of the importance of engaging and trying to kind of link up with those who are standing against it in various ways. Arfa mentioned the letter in support of the wire, which we have also been we've also signed as an organization, also been circulating. So we are basically carrying on with these both these kinds of discussions, but also trying to, as I said, find ways of carrying on doing our work in solidarity with those who are resisting these kinds of things. I know that there are quite a few questions and comments which there hasn't been time to address, but I just urge everyone to have a look at the comments thread and the Q&A, because there's lots of important points that have been raised there as well. Yeah, I just wanted to say a massive thank you to Arfa and Farzana for joining us all the way from Delhi and Colombo, and helping us to have this first Zoom webinar. The technology seems to have more or less worked, which is brilliant. And I would really suggest that you you follow the speakers and read their work, and carry on kind of following what's going on in South Asia, and making these connections, because I think making these connections between what we can see about the forces of fascism in these neighboring countries and the way they actually link up with each other, as well as exchanging ideas about how they can be resisted, is absolutely essential at the moment. So yeah, just a quick kind of reminder that please do follow South Asia Solidarity Group. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, and also please do follow us on Instagram if you can, because that's where we're going to be doing our fundraising event. And that fundraising event on 25th March, as I said, the funds will be going to the relief efforts, but relief efforts which are being done very much within that framework of countering the fake news and the communal violence which is being whipped up on that basis. So yeah, huge thank you again, and thank you to everyone who participated, and hope to see you all again soon. Okay, bye.